Hey guys, tonight we're going far back across deserts, empires, and centuries to explore the surprising story of salt. Not just something on your dinner table, but once one of the most valuable substances on Earth. Wars were fought over it, cities were built on it, entire economies depended on it. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you truly enjoy these calm, history filled journeys. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, Ichikara, and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see this quiet little community growing all over the world. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let's begin tonight's story from start to sleep. There's a quiet kind of power that lies in the ordinary. A grain of salt, small and pale, dissolves without sound, without notice. Yet for thousands of years its absence could bring down kings. Its presence could raise empires. It is the flavor of the ocean, the crystal of the earth, and the reason for war. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world before the humming of machines, before refrigeration, before packaged food on store shelves. A world where the ability to preserve a single fish meant the difference between feast and famine. In that world, salt was not just seasoning, salt was survival. And so this simple mineral, one you might sprinkle casually on your dinner, was once more precious than gold. Empires crumbled in its name. Roads were carved across mountains and deserts to carry it. Armies marched for it. Revolutions ignited because of it. Tonight, as your eyes begin to grow heavy and the day's noise fades into stillness, let us drift back in time into the dust of forgotten roads and the salt-laden winds of ancient coasts. Let us explore the story of salt, the wars it started, the cities it built, and the silent power it held over the course of human history. This is not just a history of trade or of minerals. This is a story of human need, of desire, of invention, and of the hidden forces that shaped the world while the rest of us slept. Salt is, after all, in your very blood. It is in your tears. It is what flows through you, echoing the ancient seas from which all life came. Our connection to salt is not just physical, it is historical, cultural, symbolic. Across continents and centuries, civilizations rose and fell in pursuit of it. In Africa, caravans of camels crossed the endless Sahara to trade slabs of salt for gold. In China, dynasties funded entire armies with salt taxes. In France, a hated levy on salt helped spark a revolution. And in India, one man walked hundreds of miles toward the sea, bent not on conquest, but on salt. Salt was not only the currency of emperors, it was the treasure of farmers, of fishermen, of merchants. It was a line between life and death, wealth and poverty, control and resistance. It was hidden in marshes and mountains, in lakes and underground caves. Where salt flowed, power followed. But salt did not shout, it whispered. It worked quietly, preserving food in dark cellars, keeping armies fed through brutal winters, flavoring the meals of nobles and peasants alike. It was in every kitchen, every wound, every altar, and still it rarely took credit. Other riches wore their value openly, gold glinting in the sun, spices filling ships with exotic scent. Salt merely did its work, and perhaps that's why we forgot. In today's world, where salt costs pennies and comes in plastic shakers, we can forget how much was once sacrificed to possess it. But history remembers. It remembers the Roman roads paved for salt caravans. It remembers the castles built to guard salt springs. It remembers the blood spilled in salt mines, the riots over salt taxes, the marches in defiance of monopolies. So tonight, let us remember too. Let us walk, slowly and softly, through the long corridors of time, where salt was never just salt, but a symbol of life itself. Take a breath. Let the stories come to you gently, like wind over dry fields, or the lapping of waves on a salt-covered shore. This is the war over salt, and it begins with silence. Ancient salt empires, cradle of civilization. Before there were nations, before borders, kings, or coins, there was salt. In the earliest stirrings of human settlement, as wandering tribes first began to tame the land and plant the seeds of agriculture, salt was already there, hidden in the soil, crusting the edges of dried lakes, whispering its importance through the instincts of life itself. It began quietly. Along riverbanks in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, people noticed the places where plants grew sweeter, where livestock lingered longer, licking the rocks and soil. These were the signs of salt, and where salt gathered, people followed. The Sumerians, among the earliest civilizations, built canals not only for water, but to manage brine fields. In their cuneiform tablets, salt was recorded as part of temple offerings, a divine gift. Even in these early cities of clay and reed, salt was already wealth. To the north of Mesopotamia, the Hittites guarded salt routes across Anatolia. To the southwest, in ancient Egypt, salt held another kind of power. It was the key to eternity. The Egyptians did not just eat salt, they used it to preserve the dead. Natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, dried the body and was believed to prepare the soul for its journey into the afterlife. Salt, therefore, was not just a mineral. It was sacred, eternal. It was found in tombs stored beside gold and precious oils, as important for the next world as for this one. Egypt also harvested salt from the marshes along the Nile Delta. Workers would evaporate seawater in shallow basins, leaving behind the life-giving crystals. These early salt pans were simple but effective, and they allowed Egypt to store food for long periods, support its massive armies, and feed laborers building the pyramids. Salt was the quiet fuel behind the grandeur. Far to the east, in ancient China, salt was no less important. Nearly 4,000 years ago, Chinese communities near the Yellow River began boiling brine from wells. These wells, drilled into underground salt deposits, were technological marvels for their time, some stretching over 100 meters deep. The Chinese weren't just producers of salt, they were the first to treat it as a state-controlled commodity. During the Zhou dynasty, salt became a strategic resource. By the time of the Han dynasty, salt taxes were funding roads, canals, and even the military. The emperor's hand reached into every grain of salt harvested, and from this humble mineral came power, not just over food, but over people. Historians consider the Chinese salt monopoly to be one of the earliest examples of centralized state control over natural resources. It would become a model replicated and feared throughout history. Meanwhile, across the Indian subcontinent, communities were harvesting salt from coastal flats, letting the sun do the work. As the waters of the Indian Ocean retreated daily with the tide, shimmering salt crystals were left behind. These too would later come under control of kingdoms and empires, and eventually, colonizers. Even in pre-Columbian America, long before European contact, civilizations understood salt's worth. The Maya in Central America traded salt across great distances. Some settlements were established entirely for its production, and wars were fought over access to salt-rich marshes. Among the Aztecs, salt was so valuable it was used as tribute. To the north, in the regions of the Great Lakes, Native American tribes extracted salt from springs and used it for both seasoning and ceremonial practices. Salt was universal, but its scarcity and the difficulty of transport made it exclusive. In many parts of the ancient world, salt deposits were far from cities. It had to be carried across deserts, rivers, and mountains. This created salt routes, ancient highways carved not by the desire for conquest, but for sustenance. Some of the earliest known trade networks were based on salt. In Central Europe, Hallstatt in modern-day Austria became a major center for salt mining as early as 1000 BCE. The word Hall, meaning salt, is still preserved in the names of many towns. Hallstatt's salt mines offered more than food preservation. They became a cradle for Iron Age culture, linking salt to both economy and identity. Salt did more than season food. It preserved meat and fish. It allowed for urban living, trade, and travel. Before refrigeration, it was the only way to store protein over time and distance. Civilizations that controlled salt controlled time itself. They could eat months later, feed soldiers far from home, and outlast sieges. It's no exaggeration to say that without salt, cities could not have become cities. The first urban centers, the first written records, the first taxes, even the first organized labor systems, salt was part of them all. And as these early empires grew, salt was elevated beyond a resource. It became part of law, part of ritual, part of power. In Babylon, clay tablets record disputes over salt lands and brine rights, proof that salt was both valuable and contested. In Egypt, priests believed salt purified the spirit. In China, it funded expansion and centralized government. In India, it flowed in quiet cycles of moon and tide, a humble constant, until foreign powers claimed it. Wherever people settled, they looked for water, but wherever they stayed, they needed salt. In some cultures, salt was more than practical, it was ceremonial. In ancient Judea, salt was part of covenants, symbolic of permanence and faith. In early Greece, salt was offered to guests as a sacred sign of hospitality. Across Africa, it was traded as equal to gold, brick for brick. In time, the trails carved by salt traders would become the foundations of roads and trade empires. What began with salt would expand to silk, to spices, to gold and silver, but it always began with salt. And so from the marshes of Egypt to the wells of China, from the caves of Europe to the deserts of Africa, the story of salt is the story of the first great steps of civilization. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine these early days. The clang of copper tools in a salt mine, the glittering crust left behind in a sunlit pan, the caravan winding through hills carrying a cargo more valuable than treasure. Imagine the weight of a single block of salt on the back of a camel, on the back of a slave, on the back of history. The first cities were not born from gold, they rose from salt. Rome's salty foundations, power, roads, and pay. Beneath the marble columns and triumphant arches of ancient Rome, beneath the roar of the Colosseum and the steady march of legions, there lies something far more humble, salt. To understand the strength of the Roman Empire, its lasting roads, its disciplined armies, and its enduring administration, we must first understand something that does not sparkle like gold, nor gleam like silver. We must understand the quiet foundation of salt. It begins with a road, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Long before Rome was an empire, before it was even a city, this road wound its way from the salt flats at the mouth of the Tiber River inland toward the hills of the Sabines. The Sabines, an early Italic people, held high ground and fertile land, but they needed salt. The coast had it, the Sabines did not. And so the Via Salaria was born, not as a military route, but as a trade route for the transport of salt. Sabine traders would carry wool and livestock southward. Roman salt merchants would bring back precious crystals of white and gray, dried from sea marshes under the Mediterranean sun. That road, carved by need, flattened by footsteps, would become one of the arteries of Roman expansion. As the Republic grew, its armies and administrators would march the same path. In many ways, Rome grew from a salt trade route. Salt did more than travel in Rome. It flowed through the very heart of its government. The word salary, which we use so casually today, comes from the Latin salarium. And salarium? It was the money paid to Roman soldiers for the purchase of salt. Some historians debate whether soldiers were literally paid in salt or whether their wages included a salt allowance. But the symbolism is clear. Salt was vital enough to be tied directly to the payment of the empire's protectors. The Roman army could not march without salt. Their rations of dried meats, grains, and fish all relied on it. When Rome's legions set out across Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, or into the deserts of the east, they did not just carry weapons, they carried salt stores. Without preservation, an army could not feed itself. Without food, it could not move. Rome's administrators understood this deeply. Salt became a state concern, produced, stored, and taxed under government supervision. Rome controlled key salt works across Italy and in conquered provinces. It monitored trade and quality, and in many cases restricted access. Controlling salt meant controlling the stomach, and by extension the state. It was not just about food. Salt was used in medicine, in sanitation, in religious ritual. Roman priests used salt in offerings to the gods. Salt and flour were sprinkled on sacrificial animals. Soldiers cleaned wounds with salt water. Midwives used it during childbirth. In every aspect of Roman life, salt appeared quietly, efficiently, constantly. And so, it was protected. In some regions, salt springs and mines were guarded like treasure. Roman engineers built storage facilities and distribution centers, early logistical hubs to ensure that salt could be moved quickly to where it was needed most. In the provinces, governors had authority over the local salt production. Taxes were levied on merchants. In many cases, communities were required to buy certain amounts of salt, ensuring a steady flow of revenue back to Rome. But with control came resistance. In some regions, particularly in Gaul and the eastern provinces, local populations had long produced and traded their own salt. Roman oversight disrupted these systems, and sometimes incited quiet rebellion. We do not hear of great salt wars in Roman times, but we do see a steady pattern of salt being tied to civil unrest, smuggling, and local discontent. Salt smugglers, salarii furta, became a problem in various provinces. Like later in history under French and British monopolies, salt's essential nature made it hard to regulate without angering the people. And yet, despite this, Rome persisted, because Rome understood systems. Rome understood infrastructure. It was not enough to control the source of salt. One had to build the roads to move it, the storage to hold it, the bureaucracy to tax it, and the military to protect it. In many ways, salt was a prototype for how Rome governed its empire. What began with the Via Salaria became a model. Every trade route paved, every new town linked to a supply chain. The Roman obsession with roads, famous for the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was driven not only by military might, but by logistics. Grain, wine, olive oil, and yes, salt needed to move swiftly. Salt gave the Romans more than flavor, it gave them foresight. Even culturally, salt held a place of meaning. In Roman tradition, sharing a meal with salt symbolized trust and alliance. To eat salt with someone was to create a bond. This was reflected in legal language and in literature. Salt was stable, enduring. It did not spoil or rot. It preserved, and that symbolism seeped into Rome's vision of itself. Rome wanted to last forever, and what lasts longer than salt? So, when we think of Rome, it's aqueducts, forums, legions, and laws. We should also think of the small things: the salt in the pack of a marching centurion, the brine in a cook's pot deep in the Subura, the salt-dusted lips of a priest making sacrifice, the tiny crystal shining pale in the palm of a merchant's hand. These are not the symbols carved in marble, but they are the building blocks of empire. As the Roman Empire expanded, so too did its salt networks, stretching across North Africa, deep into the Balkans, over the Alps, and across the Channel into Britannia. Wherever Rome went, it brought with it the expectation of infrastructure, taxation, and supply. And at the core of this model was salt. When the empire finally fell, what remained were roads. And what followed those roads, long after the legions were gone? Salt traders. So now, as you rest, imagine the sound of sandals on stone, the soft clinking of tools and salt pans along the Tiber, the hum of wagons rolling out of Ostia, carrying the quiet treasure of Rome, not gold, not silver, but salt. And without it, Rome may never have been Rome at all. Sacred salt, religion, rituals, and symbolism. Salt to us now is a seasoning, a staple on every table, a taste we take for granted. But once it was sacred. Salt was not merely a mineral, it was ritual, blessing, covenant. Across continents and civilizations, it held spiritual power. It was used not only to preserve food, but to preserve order, to bind agreements, to protect the soul from corruption and evil. Salt in the ancient Near East, the birth of sacredness. Some of the oldest written texts in the world, Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, contain references to salt used in religious offerings. As early as 2000 BCE, salt was offered to the gods alongside incense, grain, and oil. It was burned in temples as a symbol of purification. The Sumerians believed that salt had a divine origin, because the sea was associated with primordial creation and chaos, Tiamat in their mythology. Sea salt was a symbol of transformation, of the divine distilled into form. In ancient Babylon, salt was ritually used to cleanse temple spaces. It was sprinkled over altars and thresholds to ward off evil spirits. The concept of salt as a purifier would spread far beyond Mesopotamia into Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the spiritual systems of Asia. Salt in the Hebrew tradition, the covenant of salt. In the Hebrew Bible, salt is more than a seasoning. It is a sign of permanence and sacred agreement. In Leviticus 2:13, God commands, "You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt." This idea, the covenant of salt, appears multiple times in the Old Testament. In Numbers 18:19, it is again described as a symbol of eternal promise between God and his people. But why salt? Salt is enduring. It doesn't rot, spoil, or decay. It preserves. It was a perfect metaphor for an unbreakable, incorruptible relationship between the divine and the mortal. In ancient Israelite rituals, salt was sprinkled on animal sacrifices before they were burned on the altar. This was not simply symbolic, it was understood as a requirement. A sacrifice without salt was incomplete. Salt also played a role in temple purification. Priests of the first and second temples in Jerusalem used salt water to wash themselves before performing rituals. The mixture was believed to banish spiritual impurity. To this day, in Jewish tradition, challah bread is dipped in salt before being eaten on the Sabbath, a quiet echo of the ancient covenant. Ancient Egypt, salt, and the journey to eternity. In ancient Egypt, salt held a central role in mummification, the preservation of the body for the afterlife. The compound natron, found in desert deposits and dry lake beds, was a blend of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and salt. This substance was packed into the body cavities and applied externally to desiccate the flesh. Without salt, there could be no mummies, and without mummies, no eternal life. Thus, salt was the gateway between worlds. The deceased were buried with salt not only for preservation, but as a symbolic passage, a mineral both of this world and the next. Salt was also offered in funerary rituals, combined with oils, wine, and incense. It cleansed the offerings made to Osiris, Anubis, and Ra. It preserved fruit and meat stored in tombs for the soul's sustenance. Greece and Rome. Salt as a symbol of law and hospitality among the ancient Greeks. Salt carried divine associations with the gods of hospitality and justice. To share a meal with salt was to make a sacred pact with your guest. This wasn't just a courtesy, it was a moral and spiritual obligation. Breaking that pact was seen as an offense against Zeus Xenios, the god of hospitality and oath-keeping. Greek priests used salt in purification rituals, particularly in cleansing sacred spaces before festivals and sacrifices. Salted cakes and meats were common offerings. The Romans inherited and expanded these traditions. In Roman religion, salt was inseparable from sacrifice. It was mixed with flour, mola salsa, and sprinkled on animals before they were killed in sacred rites. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, prepared sacred salt cakes used in public rituals. These cakes were considered essential to maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. To the Romans, salt was order, sanctity, and social cohesion. To violate salt, whether by defiling it, refusing it, or cheating in trade, was a kind of sacrilege. Christianity, salt of the earth. In the New Testament, salt takes on a deeply spiritual and metaphorical role. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned?" Matthew 5:13. Here, salt represents moral integrity, truth, and influence. Just as salt preserves and enhances, the followers of Christ are to preserve the world from decay through faith, compassion, and righteousness. Early Christians also associated salt with baptism and protection from evil. For centuries, infants were given a tiny taste of salt before baptism, believed to fortify the soul against corruption. Salt was kept in churches, used in blessings, and even sprinkled in homes as a folk Christian custom to protect against malevolent spirits or bad luck. To break bread and salt with someone became a Christian echo of earlier Roman and Jewish customs, symbolizing peace, communion, and trust. Islam, salt in prophetic medicine. In Islamic tradition, salt is referenced in hadith literature, the sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. While not as central as in Judaism or Christianity, it appears in contexts of health, purity, and spiritual balance. Some traditions recommend beginning and ending a meal with a small taste of salt, linking it to moderation and digestive health. Others mention salt as a component of prophetic medicine, used for cleansing, for warding off the evil eye, and as a blessing. In Sufi mysticism, salt is sometimes used symbolically to represent the dissolving of the ego or the preservation of spiritual truth. Hinduism and the sacred tides. In Hindu rituals, salt is used for purification, protection, and balance. It's believed to absorb negative energy and is often included in offerings to deities during pujas. In some ceremonies, participants wash their hands with salt water to cleanse themselves of impurities. Salt may also be scattered around a space to ward off spirits or cleanse a home after illness or death. The ocean, source of salt, is considered holy in Hindu tradition. Pilgrims bathe in sacred waters like the Ganges or coastal sites, believing the saline element purifies the soul. In Ayurveda, salt plays a role in maintaining the body's equilibrium, balancing doshas, and supporting digestion and longevity. Folk traditions and superstitions. The global reach. Across cultures, salt has long been used as a folk talisman. In Europe, spilling salt was seen as bad luck, a belief traced back to the Last Supper, where Judas supposedly spilled salt as a foreshadowing of betrayal. The remedy: throw a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil. In Japan, salt is sprinkled in doorways after funerals to prevent spirits from following mourners home. In Slavic cultures, newlyweds are welcomed with bread and salt, symbols of abundance and enduring love. In Africa, salt is part of tribal rituals, used in oaths, initiation rites, and healing ceremonies. Salt was never just a mineral, it was a border between the seen and the unseen. It was the purifier, the preserver, the protector, salt and empire, the African gold salt trade. In West Africa, between the 8th and 16th centuries, one of the most significant economic exchanges in world history took place across a vast and hostile desert, the trans-Saharan gold salt trade. The Sahara, often seen as a barrier, became the central artery of a trade network that helped build some of Africa's most powerful empires. This trade was driven by two resources of immense value: gold, abundant in the forests of West Africa, and salt, mined in the arid zones of the Sahara. Contrary to modern assumptions, salt was not merely a seasoning. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, salt was so scarce and so vital that it was traded at equal value to gold, and at times even higher. Geography and need, salt and gold, in contrasting worlds. West Africa's forest regions, particularly in what is now southern Mali and Ghana, were rich in gold deposits. The Bambouk, Bure, and Lobi goldfields were some of the most productive sources of gold in the medieval world. However, these regions lack one critical resource: salt. In contrast, the Sahara Desert, particularly in regions such as Takhaza and Taodeni in present-day Mali, contained vast natural deposits of rock salt. These salt slabs were harvested from ancient dried seabeds and cut into large rectangular blocks. The people of the Sahel, the transitional belt between the desert and the savanna, acted as intermediaries. They facilitated long-distance trade caravans that moved both resources between zones, using camels to cross hundreds or thousands of kilometers of arid terrain. Taghaza and Taoudeni, cities of salt. Taghaza was one of the most important salt mining centers of medieval West Africa. Located in the heart of the Sahara, it was a barren outpost with almost no food or vegetation. Its only purpose was salt extraction. According to the 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited the region, even the buildings in Taghaza were constructed from blocks of salt. Workers lived in extremely harsh conditions, surviving entirely on imported food from the south. Later, the center of salt mining shifted to Taoudeni, farther north. Here, the salt was cut into rectangular slabs, typically weighing about 30–40 kilograms each. These slabs were then loaded onto camels and caravans, often numbering thousands of animals, and transported south. Salt from these mines became currency, tribute, and state revenue for the empires that controlled the trade routes. Ghana Empire, CO 700, 1200, the earliest salt gold power. The Empire of Ghana, not to be confused with modern Ghana, was the first major West African state to gain wealth and power from trans-Saharan trade. Located in present-day southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, Ghana controlled the southern terminals of desert trade routes and taxed goods as they passed through. Gold was extracted from regions to the south, and salt was brought in from the north. Ghana's rulers collected taxes in both salt and gold, and archaeological evidence suggests that the king monopolized gold nuggets, allowing only dust gold to be traded freely. This maintained royal control over currency and wealth. Arab historians such as al-Bakri wrote of Ghana's grandeur, describing its capital Kumbi Sala as a vibrant city with separate Muslim and traditionalist quarters. Salt was a key commodity traded in its markets. Mali Empire, ca. 1235–1600, the rise of Timbuktu and state regulation. After Ghana's decline, the Mali Empire rose under the leadership of Sundiata Keita in the early 13th century. Mali extended its control over the gold-producing regions, and key trade cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne. These cities became commercial, cultural, and religious centers, supported in large part by salt and gold revenues. Under Mansa Musa, Mali's most famous ruler, the empire reached its peak. During his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, Mansa Musa famously distributed so much gold in Cairo that it reportedly caused inflation. But Mali's internal economy continued to rely on salt. Salt slabs were used as currency, exchanged for slaves, livestock, grain, and other goods. In markets, one block of salt could buy multiple cows or large sacks of millet. The empire taxed salt heavily as it entered and exited cities, often taking one-third or more as tax. The administration maintained official saltway stations, regulated prices, and controlled the protection of caravans, ensuring trade security over vast distances. Songhai Empire, c. 1464–1591. Bureaucracy and expansion of salt trade. The Songhai Empire, which succeeded Mali, inherited much of the same trade infrastructure. Under rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai developed a highly centralized administration, with officials appointed to oversee trade routes, tax collection, and military protection. The salt trade continued to be centered on Gao and Timbuktu, and Songhai expanded its influence over the salt mines of Taoudeni. Salt in Songhai was stored in massive warehouses and distributed through merchant guilds. Prices were regulated by the state, and caravans were organized on an industrial scale, sometimes up to 25,000 camels per season. The control of both source and distribution allowed Songhai to maintain one of the most sophisticated trade networks in pre-colonial Africa. Logistics and caravans. How salt moved across a desert. Trans-Saharan salt caravans, often called azalai, followed established routes connecting Taghaza or Taoudeni to cities like Timbuktu and beyond. These routes took several weeks or even months to traverse. Camels, ideally suited to desert travel, were used exclusively. A single camel could carry 2 salt slabs. Caravans included guides, guards, cooks, and laborers. Rest stops, called oases, were essential for survival. Water was rationed carefully. Salt was tied tightly in leather to prevent loss or crumbling during transport. The risk was enormous. Sandstorms, raids, bandits, and dehydration threatened every journey, but the profit potential was equally great. Salt slabs arriving in the southern cities were often worth 10 times their value at the source. Cultural and economic impact. The trade in salt and gold did more than generate wealth. It also enabled urbanization. Cities like Timbuktu grew into centers of scholarship, law, and architecture. Spread Islam. Muslim merchants and scholars settled along trade routes, building mosques and schools. Standardized currency, salt and gold, enabled tax systems, coinage, and commercial accounting, supported slavery. Slaves were both traded for salt and used in salt mines, particularly in Taghaza and Taoudeni. Salt shaped the very structure of empires, how they taxed, governed, and expanded. Decline of the trade. By the 17th century, the trans-Saharan salt-gold trade began to decline due to several factors. The collapse of Songhai after the Moroccan invasion in 1591. Shifts in global trade routes after European maritime exploration bypassed the Sahara, increasing European control over African coasts, redirecting trade toward Atlantic ports. Salt remained important in local economies, but its geopolitical role diminished as new centers of power and trade emerged elsewhere. Salt, in medieval West Africa, was not only a mineral, It was the engine of state, the currency of empires, and a commodity that rivaled gold in value. The African gold salt trade stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of how a basic human need, salt, could drive the rise of some of the greatest civilizations the continent has ever known. Salt in Asia, China's monopoly, and the Tang dynasty's salt tax. Salt has been central to Chinese civilization for over 4 millennia. From early dynastic times, salt was not only an economic good, it was a tool of statecraft. Among all world civilizations, China developed perhaps the most sophisticated, long lasting, and centralized salt administration system in history. Early use of salt in ancient China. The earliest evidence of salt use in China dates back to the Neolithic period, around 6000 BCE, with signs of brine evaporation in areas like Xieqi Lake in Shaanxi province. By the time of the Shang dynasty, c. It's 1600 1046 BCE, salt was already being extracted in significant quantities. Archaeological evidence from Zhongba in modern-day Sichuan shows large-scale salt production by boiling brine in ceramic vessels, an early example of industrial food processing. During the Zhou dynasty, 1046 256 BCE, salt production and trade became more organized. Salt was considered a public good, and control over salt resources was associated with regional power. The state enters, Han Dynasty and the birth of the salt monopoly. The first major step towards state control of salt occurred under the Western Han Dynasty, particularly under the reign of Emperor Wu, 141 to 87 BCE. Faced with rising military expenses and territorial expansion, the Han state nationalized key resources salt, iron, and alcohol. In 119 BCE, the emperor created a government monopoly on salt production and distribution, effectively ending private ownership of salt works. A central salt and iron commission was established, tasked with regulating salt mines, setting prices, and collecting revenue. The move was controversial. Confucian scholars opposed it, arguing that it overburdened the people. Legalist administrators defended it as a necessary measure for strengthening the state. By the end of the Han Dynasty, salt had become one of the main sources of government income, second only to land taxes. Tang Dynasty, 618-907, the institutionalization of the salt tax. The Tang Dynasty marked a turning point in the history of Chinese salt administration. In the 8th century, following the An Lushan Rebellion, 755-763, a devastating civil war that drained the state's finances, the Tang court needed a stable, reliable source of revenue that could not be easily evaded or disrupted. The solution was the salt tax. Around 758 CE, the Tang government established the Salt and Iron Monopoly Bureau, Yan Tizi, under the Ministry of Revenue. A new policy called the Salt Certificate System, Yan Yin, was introduced. Here's how it worked. Salt was produced mainly in government-controlled salt fields in coastal regions, particularly in Sichuan, Jiangsu, and Shandong. Merchants purchased salt licenses or certificates from the government, giving them the right to transport and sell a specified quantity of salt. The cost of the license included a built-in tax, which merchants passed on to consumers. The salt itself was then sold at controlled prices throughout the empire. This system allowed the government to collect taxes in advance without needing a complex collection apparatus at the point of sale. It was also difficult to avoid since salt was a necessity. Everyone consumed it, rich and poor alike. By the end of the Tang period, the salt tax accounted for over 50% of the imperial treasury's income. Song Dynasty, 960-1279. Refinement and expansion. The Song Dynasty, known for its economic dynamism and administrative sophistication, further refined the salt monopoly. By this time, the government classified salt producing areas into several major zones: coastal solar evaporation fields in places like Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Guangdong, inland brine wells, especially in Sichuan, where advanced technology allowed producers to drill deep into underground saltwater reserves, salt lakes such as those in Shaanxi and Inner Mongolia. The Song bureaucracy maintained detailed records of salt output, merchant quotas, and revenue flow. Local officials worked closely with salt merchants, who were granted regional monopolies in exchange for delivering fixed tax amounts. During the Song era, state revenues from salt taxes averaged 20–30% of total revenue, funding infrastructure, armies, and civil administration. However, the system was not without problems. Corruption, smuggling, and abuse by middlemen led to growing dissatisfaction among peasants and urban consumers. Yuan and Ming dynasties, militarization, and the Yanyun system. Under the Yuan dynasty, 1271 1368, the Mongol rulers continued the salt monopoly. They introduced a practice known as the Yanyun system, where salt licenses were granted to merchants in exchange for transporting grain to the frontiers or supplying the military. This barter-like arrangement effectively linked salt taxation to military logistics. Merchants who fulfilled quotas received the right to sell salt in designated regions. This served two purposes. It outsourced military provisioning to private actors. It kept the salt revenue flowing without drawing on government administrative resources. The Ming dynasty, 1368–1644, maintained the system but attempted to curb its worst abuses. Despite reforms, the Ming period witnessed widespread corruption in the Salt Bureau. Officials colluded with smugglers, fake certificates were sold, salt prices soared in some areas, leading to unrest. In some provinces, salt riots broke out, particularly during famines or tax hikes. Nonetheless, salt remained a pillar of the Ming economy, a regulated, taxed, and controlled commodity that helped keep the massive imperial machine running. Qing Dynasty, 1644–1912. Reform and decline. The Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, inherited the complex salt monopoly system and attempted to modernize it. Early Qing rulers maintained strict state control, but by the 18th and 19th centuries, growing population, corruption, and increased smuggling undermined the monopoly. Salt evasion became common in remote provinces. Attempts at reform included abolishing private salt merchant monopolies and replacing them with more open licensing systems, allowing some local production and sale without going through imperial bureaucracy. However, by the late 19th century, the salt monopoly was no longer efficient. Foreign imports, changing trade patterns, and the rise of industrial salt production made the old system obsolete. After the fall of the Qing, the Chinese Republic maintained a salt tax system for a time, ironically under pressure from Western powers, who demanded repayment of foreign loans secured by salt revenue. Legacy and historical significance. China's salt monopoly and tax system were remarkable in several ways. It was one of the longest-running continuous state monopolies in history, lasting over 2,000 years. It provided a stable, predictable revenue stream even during times of war and famine. It fostered a class of powerful salt merchants, who often acted as financiers and political brokers. It enabled the development of detailed bureaucratic systems for licensing, transport, taxation, and enforcement. However, it also caused significant economic inequality as the poor bore a disproportionate burden of high salt prices, created opportunities for corruption at every level of government, sparked resistance, unrest, and smuggling, particularly in provinces distant from central oversight. Salt in imperial China was not just a necessity, it was a fiscal engine, a tool of governance, and a symbol of state power. It funded armies, built canals, and filled imperial treasuries. And like so many empires before and after, China used salt not merely to flavor food, but to sustain its civilization. Salt and Rome. How a mineral built an empire. Salt was essential to the development of ancient Rome, not only as a dietary necessity, but as a strategic commodity that shaped military logistics, road building, economy, and taxation. From its earliest days as a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber, Rome understood the value of controlling access to salt. One of the earliest Roman roads, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was built specifically to transport salt from the salt pans near the mouth of the Tiber River inland to the Sabine tribes and beyond. This route predated many of Rome's military conquests and served as a commercial artery long before the Republic became an empire. The name of the road itself reveals the centrality of salt in Roman infrastructure. The Latin word sal, meaning salt, is the root of several terms that still survive today. The word salary comes from salarium, which was originally a ration or allowance given to Roman soldiers to buy salt, or in some cases, paid directly in salt. This was not because salt was rare, but because it was vital, used for food preservation, curing meat, and maintaining health during military campaigns. Salt production in Rome was mainly centered around the salt pans of Ostia, near the mouth of the Tiber River. These evaporation fields were among the first state-controlled economic assets. The Roman state maintained a monopoly on salt production and regulated its distribution. Salt was one of the first commodities in the Roman world to be taxed systematically. The Roman administration developed a network of publicani, tax farmers, who collected revenue from salt merchants. These private contractors bid for the right to collect salt taxes and in return paid a fixed amount to the state. This system allowed Rome to maintain relatively steady income without creating a massive state bureaucracy. As Rome expanded, control over salt supplies became a strategic objective. Provinces with natural salt sources were heavily exploited. In areas like Hispania, Gallia, and North Africa, salt mines and pans were developed under military supervision. Soldiers were often tasked with guarding these installations or ensuring the movement of salt convoys along secured roads. Salt was also used as a tool of conquest. By providing access to salt or denying it, Rome could reward allies and punish enemies. Cities that aligned with Rome might receive favorable salt terms or be allowed to produce and trade salt freely. Conversely, rebellious regions often faced embargoes or the destruction of their salt works. In domestic Roman life, salt played a symbolic and ritual role. It was part of religious ceremonies, offered to gods during sacrifices, and sprinkled on altars. The phrase cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, has its origins in these Roman practices. Salt was also used in legal and diplomatic contexts. Treaties were sealed with offerings of salt and bread. The central government created price controls to prevent speculation in salt markets. The aediles, Roman magistrates responsible for public supplies and food markets, monitored salt prices and punished merchants who inflated costs or diluted the product. These controls were particularly important in times of war or famine when salt demand spiked sharply. In the city of Rome itself, salt was sold in public markets and distributed by licensed vendors. The state sometimes provided subsidized salt rations to the urban poor, especially during times of unrest. These rations, like the later Annona grain distribution, helped maintain civil stability in a growing metropolis. Military logistics in the Roman Empire relied heavily on salt for food preservation. Armies marching across Gaul, Germania, or the Middle East needed durable, preserved meat. Salted pork and fish became staples of Roman military diet. Without salt, long campaigns would have been logistically impossible. Even in the post-Republican and imperial eras, salt retained its economic importance. Emperors such as Augustus and later Diocletian maintained salt as a state-controlled good. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 CE, included fixed prices for salt and harsh penalties for those who violated them. Salt routes were among the most protected roads in the empire. Outposts and way stations were placed at regular intervals to guard shipments and monitor merchants. Roman engineers built bridges and tunnels specifically for salt convoys in mountainous provinces. The symbolic power of salt extended even to Rome's enemies. When Rome destroyed the city of Carthage in 146 BCE, a later legend claimed that Roman soldiers sowed the fields with salt to curse the land and prevent it from recovering agriculturally. While this story is likely apocryphal, it reflects the idea of salt as a powerful instrument not only of sustenance, but of domination. As the Roman Empire began to decline, local control over salt became more fragmented. Private monopolies emerged in outlying provinces. Corruption spread through the tax collection system. Smuggling and black market trade increased as official salt became too expensive or scarce. Despite these problems, salt endured as a fundamental element of Rome's legacy. Its roads, taxation systems, military provisions, and administrative reforms were all built, in part, upon the control and distribution of this seemingly simple mineral. Salt helped feed legions, unite territories, and stabilize a city that once ruled the Mediterranean world. Rome's ability to manage this essential resource contributed directly to the longevity and coherence of its empire. Salt cities of medieval Europe, wealth, power, and the foundations of trade. In medieval Europe, salt was far more than a simple seasoning. It was a form of wealth, a preservative crucial to survival, and a catalyst for the rise of powerful cities and trading networks. Unlike gold or silver, salt was not a luxury, it was essential to everyday life. It preserved meat and fish through long winters and allowed armies and navies to operate far from their home territories. This necessity made it a strategic resource, fiercely controlled, heavily taxed, and deeply entwined with politics and power. Several European cities owe their origins, or at least their golden ages, to salt. Hallstatt in Austria, Salzburg, Lüneburg in northern Germany, and even cities along the North Sea that later formed the Hanseatic League. All of them became wealthy and influential through salt production, trade, and taxation. The story begins in the Alps, with one of the earliest known salt mining settlements in Europe, Hallstatt. Archaeological evidence shows that Hallstatt was already mining salt in the Bronze Age, possibly as early as 1500 BCE. The area's natural rock salt deposits allowed for a scale of production that supported not only local consumption but also long-distance trade. Salt mined deep within the Alpine mountains was transported along trade routes reaching into what is now Germany, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. The wealth of Hallstatt was so significant that an entire archaeological culture spanning from roughly 800 to 500 BCE was named after it, the Hallstatt culture. Centuries later, the nearby city of Salzburg, whose name literally means salt castle or salt fortress, became a major center of salt wealth in the medieval period. Controlled largely by the archbishops of Salzburg, salt from the nearby Dürnberg mines and the saline springs of Bad Reichenhall was transported along the Salzach River, generating enormous wealth for the ecclesiastical state. The archbishops used this wealth to build cathedrals, fortresses, and cultural institutions. Salzburg's architecture and religious power in the Holy Roman Empire were inseparable from the salt trade that funded them. In northern Germany, the city of Lüneburg emerged in the 10th and 11th centuries as one of the most important salt producers in northern Europe. The city was built near massive underground salt domes and brine springs. By boiling brine in large pan houses, Sita Hauser, Lüneburg developed an industrial-scale salt works that supplied much of the Baltic and North Sea regions. The salt from Lüneburg became known as white gold, a nickname that would reappear in other salt-producing cultures, and was shipped via the old salt road, Alte Salzstrasse, to the port of Lübeck on the Baltic coast. From there, it entered the vast commercial network of the Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities stretching from London to Novgorod. The Hanseatic League, founded in the 12th century and formalized in the 13th and 14th, was deeply involved in the salt trade. Salt was one of the League's critical commodities, not only for food preservation, but for preserving fish, especially herring, which was essential to the diet of medieval Europe, particularly during Lent and other religious fasts when meat was forbidden. Herring fleets based in the North Sea required enormous quantities of salt. Cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck became hubs where salt from the Lüneburg was exchanged for dried fish from Scandinavia and the Low Countries. This created a powerful economic triangle between salt producers, fish suppliers, and urban markets. Salt also played a role in creating municipal autonomy and political leverage. In Lüneburg, the salt trade enriched local merchants and gave them enough power to challenge ecclesiastical and noble authorities. The city council, dominated by wealthy salt traders, often acted independently of outside rulers, using salt revenues to fund public infrastructure, walls, and even military forces. Elsewhere in Europe, other salt-producing centers developed under similar principles. Aigues-Mortes in southern France became a departure point for crusades in part because of its access to Mediterranean salt flats. In Venice, salt was so central to the city's early trade that it was managed directly by the Doge and the council. Venetian salt from Chioggia helped finance the expansion of Venice's fleet and its dominance in Adriatic commerce. In England, salt production focused around areas like Nantwich, Middlewich, and Droitwich, where natural brine springs were exploited through boiling techniques. These towns had produced salt since Roman times and continued to do so through the Middle Ages, contributing to local economies and feudal revenues. Control over salt production was often a matter of life and death, literally and economically. Salt works were frequently owned by bishops, monasteries, or royal authorities. Taxes on salt were common and widely resented. In France, the hated gabelle, a royal salt tax introduced in the 14th century, became one of the key grievances that led to the French Revolution centuries later. In many of these cities, the wealth from salt helped finance not only trade and war, but also culture, education, and religion. Monasteries used salt revenues to copy manuscripts, support pilgrims, and fund hospitals. Merchant guilds invested in schools and chapels. Cathedrals rose on the back of boiling pans and brine wells. By the end of the medieval period, salt had helped shape an entire urban and mercantile civilization. The cities that controlled salt, whether through mines, springs, or coastal evaporation, held leverage over food supply chains, trade routes, and political alliances. And the networks that moved salt across the continent laid the foundations for early capitalism long before the rise of modern banks and stock markets. Salt in the Sahara, white gold in the heart of Africa. In the vast silence of the Sahara Desert, beneath a sky that rarely knew clouds, caravans wound their way across endless dunes, not in search of gold, but of salt. While Africa is often associated with gold trade in popular imagination, it was salt that sustained the economies, empires, and daily life of many West African civilizations. Salt was survival, salt was power, and in many cases it was worth more than gold. For centuries, massive caravans, sometimes numbering in the thousands of camels, journeyed across the desert, connecting the salt mines of the north to the powerful kingdoms of the south. These caravans did not merely carry goods, they carried life itself. Salt was needed in tropical climates to preserve food, to replenish the body in sweltering heat, and to sustain both humans and animals in regions where sweat never stopped and water was scarce. One of the most famous salt centers in Africa was Taghaza, located in what is now northern Mali. Taghaza was not a traditional town, it was a settlement built entirely of salt blocks, mined from nearby surface deposits. Workers, often enslaved, dug salt from shallow pits in the scorching desert heat. The slabs were then loaded onto camels and carried south through the desert to places like Timbuktu and Gao, where they were traded for gold, ivory, kola nuts, and slaves. These journeys were long and perilous. Caravans moved at night to avoid the daytime heat. Wells were few and far between. Robbers, sandstorms, and exhaustion were constant threats, yet the rewards were immense. Salt from Taghaza could be sold in the Sahel for gold by weight. In some periods, a slab of salt fetched a price equal to or greater than a slab of gold of the same size. To the Mali Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, controlling the salt routes was as important as controlling the gold mines of Bambouk or Bure. The city of Timbuktu flourished as a result, a center of learning, religion, and commerce. Timbuktu's markets bustled with salt merchants and gold dealers, scholars, and scribes, all fueled by the trade across the Sahara. The salt trade also contributed to the rise of cities like Gao, Jenne, and Kano, which grew into major commercial centers on the southern edge of the desert. In these markets, salt was more than currency, it was a form of tax, tribute, and ration. Kings collected it as tax from their subjects and redistributed it to warriors and servants. Islamic scholars traveling through Africa in the Middle Ages, like Ibn Battuta and al-Bakri, described the importance of salt in their accounts. They noted how it was stored in great warehouses, protected by guards, and how entire economies functioned around its distribution. In some towns, salt served as a form of local currency, with fixed exchange rates for food, cloth, and livestock. The Sahara, though seemingly empty, became a superhighway for goods and culture. Salt, gold, and knowledge moved together. The trade routes helped spread not only commodities, but also Islam, Arabic literacy, and scientific thought deep into the African interior. Mosques rose in the desert, libraries were filled with scrolls, and empires grew rich, not just from conquest, but from commerce. Even in the modern era, echoes of this system remain. Salt is still harvested in parts of the Sahara in traditional ways, using tools and techniques passed down for generations. In places like Bilma, in Niger, or Taudeni, in Mali, salt mining continues with human labor, animal transport, and an ancient rhythm that has barely changed in centuries. Salt, in Africa, was never just a rock. It was a symbol of endurance, connection, and human ingenuity in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Conclusion: the rock that built civilizations. Salt has no scent. It is invisible when dissolved. It does not glitter like gold, nor shine like silver. Yet for most of human history, it was more valuable than both. From the shores of China to the mines of Austria, from Roman legions to African caravans, salt shaped the course of empires, fueled wars, and created cities. It was traded across deserts, fought over by kings, and taxed by tyrants. It preserved life, it preserved power. Salt linked worlds, coastal and inland, ancient and modern, sacred and economic. It was in the sweat of soldiers and the kitchens of kings. It appeared in offerings to gods and in revolts against rulers. And though today we take it for granted, this humble mineral once held the weight of civilizations. Grain of salt, small, silent, essential.